actually want to start with what's happening at Carl right now. Can you talk a little bit about the screening process for Carl at the time being?
Sure. So the basic idea is we don't want a lot of folks to be at our facilities unless we feel they need to be seen. And it's not that we want to exclude people who are sick, it's more about making sure that people who are mildly ill or who might not need to be seen at all, we don't expose them to other folks who may be more contagious and end up making those folks sicker who could have been uh, allowed to stay at home. And really doing a good job of screening them before we put everybody together is important. And that's also why we have um, our respiratory treatment centers outside of our main convenient care and emergency department facilities, and that's so we don't just throw folks that could potentially have this virus in with folks who have a broken arm, who have a laceration on their leg, who really don't need to be exposed to this and could potentially catch this virus just because they had an accident and there's no reason for that.
Okay. And with all this going on, how are Carl employees staying safe and sanitary?
Um, well, doing the best we can. In my world, in pediatrics, this time of year, we just are used to this because most of our kids that come into the hospital this time of year over the winter months, even, it extends well into spring and it starts early in the fall, which is, longer than it used to be. We have most of our inpatients, they're admitted for infections, respiratory infections. So we're used to donning all of the protective gear and having it outside most of our patient rooms. So making sure that we follow the recommendations that are currently given to us as far as what you're supposed to wear and what's the safest practice based on the infection a patient has. And people will throw out there that the CDC has changed their guidelines at certain points. The CDC doesn't really change a lot on the fly. They've changed a couple of minor things here and there, but really they have categories where they tell us, if your supply is really good and you have plenty of protective equipment, then these are the guidelines you follow. Then, if you're kind of starting to feel it and you are worried about your supply chain and you are looking forward to, a week or two from now and you want to conserve, these are the procedures you follow. And then they have a third tier, which is more crisis mode, where you're hurting and you're going to use every last trick in the book to try and maintain. So um, we just support each other and follow the guidelines the best we can and adapt to the situation we're in. We can't create new protective equipment if there is none, so we got to use what we have and stay within the guidelines to make sure we're staying safe.
Okay. And how has that adapting been going? I mean, is there a concern about a lack of protective gear in the future? Like, where are you at right now as a facility, if you can speak to that?
So right now we're doing okay, but we know that the potential for this to get worse and be a surge is there, and it could be right around the corner. So while we are, we're not in that crisis mode yet, we are planning for it, and we're able to kind of be in that second tier where we're conserving, but we're not in crisis yet, knowing full well that give it a couple of days and something worse could happen. Um, and it's more about planning for that, but hoping we won't get there.
Sure. I want to go back to something you mentioned about the screening process, and people who are mildly ill or not showing symptoms, they're not getting tested right now, correct?
That is correct. And the thought process I'd like most people to go through when it comes to testing is, what is it going to change? What is it going to do for us? And if it's really not going to change the plan and you're going to be ill, but your symptoms are such that you aren't going to need to be seen and you can recover at home, having a test that's positive or negative is not really going to help guide anybody to treat you differently. Contrast that with somebody who's in the hospital and might need to be placed on a ventilator or might benefit from, high flow nasal support, a different kind of respiratory support. You know, I wouldn't want to use that second one for a patient that truly has this virus, or potentially it would change my decision making, knowing that person was positive for the virus. So in that case, a test would definitely be warranted. And we do our best to follow the guidelines, which are basically, if you have only mild symptoms and you can recover at home, or you have no symptoms, and in both of those scenarios you have no risk factors, then you should stay home. You shouldn't come in. You don't need a test. And what we're seeing is every once in a while folks are insisting on a test. That's a normal human thing. We want to know. There's this big thing that's looming out there and we have a test for it. Why can't you test me? Well, there's a good chance that if I test you and you don't meet the right criteria, that lab or the state screening lab where we send the sample to, there's a chance they might not even run it. And I'm going to tell you, the swab that we do, I make kind of a mean joke with parents and say it's like doing a brain biopsy through the nose. So we slip a wire with a cotton applicator on the end into the nostril all the way to the back. And when I say it's like a brain biopsy, it feels like they're scraping a little piece of your brain out. They don't, because there's walls back there to keep that from happening, but it's really unpleasant. And we honestly would not want to put somebody through that if they're going to end up not running the test anyway.
That's interesting. So, have you had cases where the labs won't run tests that you send?
I don't know of any personally. I know in the beginning, our infection control personnel, the folks who run that department in the hospital, were much more strict about what they would allow, as far as, don't test that person, but go ahead and test that person. They've relaxed that a little bit as our test supply has increased. It's still nowhere near where it should be, unfortunately. So we don't have the leeway. So I've not run into that situation, but I know it's a potential.
Talking about test supply, where are we at right now at Carle? How is the test supply there? Can you speak to that?
That I don't know, just because that's changing all the time. Even if they told me, an hour ago, I would hate to tell you and be wrong.
Sure.
Just because I'm definitely, they don't let me be in charge of much. And that's one thing they don't, I don't need to be in charge of. But the, there's a big push in clinical laboratories to get more tests and better tests. Me personally, I did a test on a young man. The last time I was on nights, and that was on the 19th. We had a result on the 22nd. So that was a faster turnaround time, 3 days, than it was when we first started, which is really pleasant. But we'd love to tighten that up even more.
Sure. And the tests right now, are they still being sent to either Chicago, Springfield, Carbondale, 2 to 3 day turnaround time?
Yeah. So if we are sending to the state for the state to run it, those are the three testing sites: Chicago, Springfield, and Carbondale. And there is the option always to send it off to a commercial lab, so say Mayo, and that's going to be a little bit longer turnaround time just because there's travel involved.
Okay.
Now, a couple of companies have come up with testing that is a shorter turnaround time once it gets there. If we're sending that off, though, you do have the travel getting it there and back.
Okay. I want to jump into a couple of Facebook questions for these last few minutes I have you. We got one question, someone asking if they test positive for the flu or they have a cold, they're sick in some way, can you also have coronavirus at the same time? Can you have coronavirus? Can you have flu? Can you have it all?
That's a really good question. So, um, with a really complicated answer. So, we're learning more about this virus all the time and the illness that it causes. And in the beginning, we knew that adults, for example, if they tested positive for another virus, the chances of them testing positive also for the coronavirus or this particular coronavirus were like less than 2%. Children, on the other hand, were having up to 40% co-infection. And I can tell you from experience, we see that a lot on pediatrics where a kid comes in and they're really sick, and then you do the respiratory swab and they've got 2 or even 3 viruses that they're positive for. And each one of them can make a kid feel like garbage, but then you stack them all on top of each other and they really feel miserable. So it is pretty common for children to have co-infection even outside of this, but they were seeing numbers up to 40%. The last number I saw was, I think, 22% co-infection rates, and I believe that number was out of Stanford. So that was, at least a United States sample. But yeah, it does not disqualify you when you test positive for the flu. But if you're an adult, it's pretty likely that you don't have another, or you don't have coronavirus on top of another illness.
Sure, okay. If you get it once, can you get it again?
I've gotten that question so many times, and um, the very unsatisfying answer is we don't know yet. But there's a couple things we can say in general about viruses, especially coronaviruses, and that is that they mutate quickly. So that means that, when we're targeting a virus or any illness in our immune system, it will make little antibodies against the bits and pieces on the surface of that virus or that bacteria or that fungus. And when it does that, it creates memory. So those little antibodies live inside of immune cells so that the next time you get exposed to that illness, then those antibodies are released and you don't even notice that you were exposed because your immune system fights it off. But if the genetics of a virus change significantly enough that the shape of the protein that that antibody is matched up with, then it just won't work anymore. And then you could potentially get infected again. But the good news is, usually if that happens, you still have a measure of protection and it's not as bad. So the short answer is we don't know. The long answer is even if you can get it again, it will probably not be as severe an illness.
Okay. I think the last question we're going to have time for is sort of a big question. We got a lot of people writing in, when will this end? And I think more specifically, they're wondering how long is it going to take to flatten the curve? How long is the social distancing need to last? Can you speak on that?
I can do my best. So the hard part about that is um, we're kind of playing a little a game of how long is long enough. And the good news is by the time we see an improvement in the numbers or improvement in the new cases, you're really looking back a number of days. And that's really the only benefit of our turnaround time for the tests being longer, is because, if we see an improvement today, you really have to look back to what we were doing 3, 4, 5 days ago to see, okay, the thing we did those days ago is what we're seeing the benefit from today. Um, and so by the time we start to see improvement, we should be already on our way there. Now, there are people way smarter than me called epidemiologists, and all they do is study the spread of illnesses. So they are the ones that are on top of this every single day, looking at regions, looking at countries, looking at individual states and provinces to see what's happening in these places and how is the curve being flattened there, and how can we replicate that elsewhere. And that's hard to do because even as this illness has passed across the world, it has mutated. So we know, things are not exactly the way they were genetically when this was first discovered back at the end of December. And so they do their best. The idea is it's probably going to be another couple of weeks where we are trying to distance ourselves from physical space sharing, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't, socially interact with people the best you can, just like we can here, because it is important to not isolate yourself socially. You should isolate yourself physically from other people, because you really have to remember to take good care of yourself mentally. But we're looking into probably the middle part of the spring, where we're going to be not at you know, our normal activity. But time will tell. Hopefully, it'll be a little bit faster.
Yeah. All right, we've got just a couple of minutes here. So, is there anything else that you want people at home to know? Anything that you think is important for people to know during all of this?
Yeah, I think, this can be something that's really scary. There's a lot of uncertainty, and I it makes me sad when I see things posted on social media that are just wrong and incite panic. Um, I would encourage everybody to make sure you have good, reliable sources that you use: CDC, WHO, Carl.org, the Champaign Public Health District, and the Illinois Department of Public Health are all good places to go to consult to see if what you're reading is accurate. Um, and the more information you gather, the less scary it can be, because fear leads to panic, and panic is definitely not going to help. Because I can only speak for our facility at Carl. We've been preparing for this. We got this. We're going to take care of everybody, and we've got a plan. The plan was there before coronavirus. We just had to modify it to fit this illness. And so, uh, rest assured, we will do everything we can in the medical world to take care of everybody. If you are concerned and you wonder if you need to be seen or not, Carl has good resources at carl.org. You can go, there's actually a screening tool where you can click on a couple of different questions and it'll tell you what to do. And if you're not sure, you can always call our hotline. It's a special hotline just for this. And that number is 902 6100, and talk to somebody about what to do.
Perfect.